bind us to each other, and as we renew our dedication and our commitment to countering violent extremism in our community. We really have no more critical task before us than the one that brings us here tonight. With the emergence of groups like ISIL, and with 150-some Americans having traveled abroad to take part in conflicts around the world, the need for our community to come together to combat this problem has never been more apparent than it is today. The U.S. Department of Justice, which I am happy to help lead as the United States Attorney in this district, is deeply engaged in this vital effort across our country. To be sure, we are committed to investigating and prosecuting American extremists who would go abroad and join terrorist groups, but we are equally as dedicated to understanding and addressing the root causes of extremism. As recently demonstrated in a White House summit called to address the issue of extremism and radicalization, the Department of Justice has engaged in extensive outreach to communities all across the country, and we plan to do much more of that at full speed in the year ahead and into next year. And through our Civil Rights Division, we have spearheaded comprehensive efforts to reduce the likelihood that individuals would engage in violence based on extremist ideologies. And we're doing that by building relationships. We're doing that by being out in our communities and listening to people. We're doing that by educating ourselves and by educating communities about the risk factors that are involved. We're doing that by taking part in eliminating the conditions that can lead to alienation, that can lead to violent extremism. And we're trying to facilitate services to young people who are at risk. It's inspiring to be here at this organization and to be among people who I think really understand that the government can't tackle this problem alone. We gain a strong and clear advantage when we work together as community partners to leverage our resources and to work towards common goals. And tonight's discussion is an opportunity to do just that. It's a concrete step toward developing a truer understanding of the problem of extremism and the ways that we can all work together to address that issue. It's an opportunity for us to nurture relationships, relationships that we can call upon to share information if and when we're faced with individuals who may have been exposed to radicalization. It's this kind of collaborative effort that is critical to the safety and the security of our communities and to the safety of our nation. As we have learned in recent days, there is no community in the United States who is immune from the problem of violent extremism. In fact, FBI Director James Comey recently confirmed that there are ongoing investigations in all 50 states in the United States. And as Director Comey stated, we have to be aware of the fact. We cannot ignore that militants are putting out a siren song through their slick propaganda, through social media. They are misleading troubled souls by promising them glory and a meaningful life if they're willing to travel overseas to engage in battles, and inviting them, if they're not able to travel, to kill somebody where they are, however they can. We have to be both innovative and aggressive in countering violent extremism, combating those who would sow intolerance, division, and hate within our borders and across the globe. We can never lose sight of the fact that the thing that violent extremists fear most is the strength of our communities, the diversity of our populations engaged in common efforts, and an enduring commitments that we in America have to freedom, to justice, and to the rule of law. All the things that make this country such a great place to live in and to raise our families. I want to thank Pacifica for arranging this event, and I want to extend my gratitude to the panelists. I want to thank you for your collaboration. I want to thank you for your leadership in the community. And I, like the rest of the folks here tonight, really look forward to hearing your important perspectives and inputs on this issue. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for introducing the panel this evening in terms of the important themes that they're addressing, the legal and justice resources that we partner with in terms of our communities and with the local government, and state government, and national government. Just to add a bit to what Laura has introduced, all societies have moral resources along with legal and other kinds of organizational resources. These moral resources are based on culture, religions, ideals, and accumulated practical wisdoms. But are these moral resources sufficient at a time when extremism is perceived to be increasing? The media shout loudly about the rise of ISIL, ISIS, or terror attacks in Paris. We need not blame the media, though. Violence is real, although not at the levels of 40 years ago, nationally and internationally. Murder rates are down in the last 40 years, dramatically so, throughout the United States. Nation states are rarely fighting each other, yet people perceive that there is something going very, very wrong, and they may be right about that. Many young people have become attracted to voices that want to bring justice when humiliation is felt, that senses a higher morality in expanding a sense of victimhood, or that sees the best defense is an offense. This vortex of extremism is a logical extension of the assertiveness training popularized 50 years ago in many ways. But it has pathological features to it that seem to counter and depreciate our existing moral resources. What to think, what to do, I think our panel is fully prepared and ready to help us in that task. So, we need to develop a moral imagination, one adequate to the unique crises we face today. That imagination can only be developed by new dialogues, new and refreshed senses of tolerance. We gather here tonight not just to mobilize old moral resources, but as moral entrepreneurs, finding new ways, elaborating and expanding a moral imagination adequate to these times. It is not a time to narrow our sympathies, but expand them. And with that, I'd like to thank our co-sponsoring organizations for tonight's event before introducing our panelists. The San Diego World Affairs Council, the Islamic Center of San Diego, the San Diego Diplomacy Council, and are all co-sponsors of tonight's event. So our first presenter is Imam Taha Hussein, and he serves as Imam of the Islamic Center of San Diego. He graduated from the Institute of Islamic Sciences at the University of Algiers in his native Algeria. He's served as a high school teacher, and he's been very, very involved in interfaith dialogues in the United States. Please welcome Imam Taha Hussein to the podium.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, in the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. I would like to start by greeting you all with the greeting of Islam, the greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum, and peace be with you all. Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me this honor to join this wonderful panel with my dear brothers, Mahdi, Jihad, and Brother Ahmed. And I have the good news is that I have only 10 minutes. And you know how hard it is to give a mic to a clergy. So I will try to squeeze what I have in mind in 10 minutes. And in these few minutes, I would like to mention a few points about this very important topic, extremism. And I would like to start by saying that Islam, which is my faith, that I practice and I'm proud of, rejects extremism in all its forms and shapes, whether in the area of beliefs or the area of worship, the rituals, and the area of behavior and interacting with people. The Islam that I believe in, the Islam that I practice and I preach at the Islamic Center of San Diego, there is no room for such extremist thoughts and views and practices. And when we go through Al-Quran, which is the main source of the Islamic teachings, the Word of God revealed to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or the Hadith, which is the prophetic tradition, the collection of the sayings and actions of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, we will find how Quran and Hadith promote moderation in all aspects of the religion as well as aspects of life. And there is a big difference between someone who go through the literal recitation of Quran without having any in-depth understanding, and someone who, whenever he or she recite the Quran and go through the verses of the Quran and the prophetic teachings, they have the tools and the means to understand the spirit of the divine message of Almighty God that He sent to this humanity through Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So Al-Quran and the Hadith, the two main sources of the Islamic teachings, they promote peace and they promote moderation in all aspects of religion, as I have mentioned, whether it's the belief area, the worship area, the morals, and the way people and Muslims are supposed to interact with one another or to interact with their non-Muslim friends and their non-Muslim neighbors. The other thing that I would like to mention here is that I believe that extremism has no particular faith or culture. Even though sometimes it's flavored with a specific faith, flavored with a specific culture, but if we try to have this comprehensive understanding, comprehensive look at extremism throughout the history of humanity, especially in the last few centuries, we will realize that extremism basically has no religion, is not associated with a specific faith or a specific culture. I believe that the only culture of extremism is hate, and the only culture, the only faith of extremism is hate, ignorance, and spreading evil. There is nothing else that we can understand extremism except in these areas of spreading the hatred and spreading the ignorance and the evil. The third point is that extremist views and behavior are not the result of religiosity. And this is something that I have heard over and over again, that when a Muslim, young Muslim, is on his way to be radicalized, one of the signs of this radicalization is what? Religiosity. Meaning that when you see this young Muslim going often to the mosque and attend the congregational prayer, when you see this young Muslim growing a beard, or sometimes criticizing the foreign policy of the US government, our own government, then these are the signs of radicalization. I totally disagree. I don't believe that religiosity is the thing that makes somebody radicalized. On the contrary, religiosity in Islam is supposed to bring somebody closer to God. Religiosity means to make this person more merciful to God's creation. So what makes somebody radicalized is when he or she goes away from the true and the authentic teachings of the Islamic faith. I have not seen somebody radicalized inside the mosque because of the language, because of the preaching of that official imam at that mosque, that some young Muslims were radicalized. It didn't happen at all. Young Muslims or other people from whatever faith and culture got radicalized through the internet, through the social media, through the bad influence. This is how people can go to the wrong path in their lives. And by saying this, I would like just to affirm, as I have mentioned many times before, that as an imam, having or connected to a large network of imams around the nation, I believe, strongly believe, that all the imams that I know around the nation are doing an excellent and awesome job in terms of educating their congregations about the true understanding of Islam and making sure that the message of Islam that they are getting in their mosques and Islamic centers will make them decent people and decent citizens of our nation. Going to some of the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. How can we, I have a hard time reconcile between what some people think that Islam or the teachings of Islam radicalize people, and when I go through the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and I see one of his sayings, Al-Khalqu iyalullah, ahabbuhum ilallahi anfa'uhum li'iyalih, where he is saying the creation, including human beings, are the dependents of God. The most beloved ones to God are those who benefit those creations. How can we understand that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, ما كان الرفق في شيء إلا زانه وما كان العنف في شيء إلا شانه. Wherever kindness is in whatever behavior, it makes it look nice, good. And whenever toughness or hard, something hard or tough is associated with any behavior, it makes it look ugly. How can we understand the teaching of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, saying, Al-Muslimu man salima al-Muslimuna min lisanihi wa yadihi. The true Muslim is the one that people are safe from his tongue and his hand, meaning the person who doesn't harm people and doesn't cause any harm. How can we understand in several sayings of the Prophet that people will be admitted to heaven on the day of judgment just because they have removed something harmful from the path of people, or just gave water to animals, to a cat, to a dog? God appreciated what they have done and will admitted them to heaven on the day of judgment. The other point that I would like to mention is that throughout the human history, we have seen people misusing their own religious sacred text to justify crimes and atrocities committed against innocent people just because they have embraced a different faith, a different culture, or different lifestyle. And we can go on different incidents that happen throughout the history of this humanity, people from all faiths who have committed crimes, but always they have to find a justification from their own scripture to justify the crimes that they have committed. And the last point is that moderate Muslims, even though I disagree with this term, because I believe that a Muslim by default, by nature, is a moderate. But let's say moderate Muslims have been speaking against extremism and rejecting its aspects from day one. But it seems that our fellow men and women, or many of them, are not paying attention. That's why every time I go and speak wherever, the first common question and comment that I receive from people, where have you been? How come we did not hear this voice? How come we have never heard you or any other Muslim leader in our community condemning or rejecting what some people have committed in the name of your faith? I hope that I will have more time in the Q&A session so we can elaborate more, and I would like to give you more information to support what I have said. Thank you so much, and God bless you all.
Our second speaker is known well to the Pacifica Institute because he has spoken here in the past, and he is a professor at San Diego State University. Ahmad Kuru is an associate professor of political science there. He did his PhD at the University of Washington, Seattle, and I'm sure you will enjoy his comments. Please welcome Ahmad Kuru.
I would like to thank Pacifica Institute for organizing this panel, and I'm a political scientist that I'd like to talk about some cause-effect relations. So a follower of world politics would be astonished by the frequency of terrorist activities, civil wars, and interstate wars in Muslim majority societies, especially for the last 15 years. But we can narrow down the question by focusing on two parameters. First, on other types of violence, Muslims are doing much better. For example, according to a recent survey, homicide rates, murder rates in Muslim majority countries is 2.5 per year per 100,000 people, whereas the world average is 7.5. So they are killed much less. The homicide rate is much less for non-political. If we look at political violence in the 20th century, it wasn't Muslims killing. It was mostly Europeans in the First World War and Second World War. And it wasn't the so-called Islamist terrorists, but it was Marxist-Leninist terrorists throughout the 20th century, even in the Middle East. So what has happened for the last 15 years? Okay? Why now we are hearing more Muslim activism on political violence recently? So first of all, I agree with Imam Taha that it is not the essence or textual basis of Islam that trigger violence politically. Everybody knows now, chapter 5, article 32 in the Quran saying, if anyone killed a person, it would be as if he killed the entire humanity, and if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he saved the life of the entire humanity. But I would like to emphasize another verse, which is much less known, on chapter 4 and article number 93. So now we know that Islamist terrorists mostly kill Muslims, and dictators from Syria to elsewhere kill Muslims. So this has nothing to do with the book. Why? Because the book says anyone who kills a believer deliberately will receive as his reward to live in hell forever. A Muslim for hell forever is very strong. But it keeps going. God will be angry with him. And then say God will curse him. I think that's enough. So, and prepare a dreadful torment for him. So, despite this verse, if a Muslim kills Muslim, a terrorist or dictator, whatever, it has nothing to do with the text. Text is very obvious and clear, right? And religions are multi-open. They are open to interpretation. Any religion can be interpreted in a peaceful way or radical way. But of course, there are radical interpretations of Islam. Okay? So it's a long debate, but very briefly, many scholars now touch upon Salafi jihadism. For European jihadists or for Middle East jihadists, there is the so-called Salafism, which is radical, literal understanding of Islam, and with combined jihadism, Salafi jihadism, is the root cause of political violence in many places. So how comes, and then you can blame Muslims, why this particular version of Islam is influential, at least for some young people. Because Salafism is controlling Mecca, Medina, and 20% of those oil reserves. So I don't blame and single out Saudi Arabia, but there is the root cause of Salafism history. Then you can say, why did Muslims let the Wahhabis, Salafis, control Mecca, Medina? So it wasn't Muslims, actually. It was Britain who let them control Mecca, Medina. I am not blaming Singleton Britain either, but you know, it's good to discuss. Why? Because for 4 centuries, it was the Ottomans, mainstream moderate Muslims, controlling Mecca, Medina. But Britain was not happy with the idea of Ottoman Caliphate, because Ottomans were intervening in the Indian colonization of, Britain colonization of India. And therefore they want to abolish the Caliphate. They support Sharif Hussein, during the First World War to defeat Ottomans, and they succeed. So Ottomans were defeated, caliphate abolished, that's it, in the First World War. Then Sharif Hussein, the ally of Britain, wanted to be the caliph. He declared his caliphate. He was a mainstream Sunni. And Britain didn't want to see any caliph, therefore they supported Salafi Wahhabis to defeat Sharif Hussein. They did, and then Saudi Arabia was funded with the British help. So therefore, if you think that the Western countries always support moderate Islam versus radical Islam, you are wrong. So that's one thing. The second thing I want to emphasize is that violence is a very complicated issue. Okay? Scholars of violence, if there's one thing they agree on, is that it's multi-causal. It has political, economic, social, psychological reasons behind it. And mostly it creates a vicious circle. If a country is economically underdeveloped, it's likely to be ignorant and schooling and literacy rate decline. Then after the mass ignorance and illiteracy, political chaos is followed. Then political chaos definitely brings violence, and it's a vicious circle. And when I'm teaching it in my classroom, I'm giving the example to my students. A student, imagine that she gets an F, gets really depressed, and keeps sleeping, watching TV, and eating next to the refrigerator, gaining weight. Then her friends think that she's a loser. Then everybody stops talking to her. She gets more depressed, get an F again, and eat more, and watch TV and sleep. So in the middle is unfortunately, so it's a tragic situation. I don't want to make fun of it, but it's like that student. So there are too many problems creating a vicious circle. And therefore, violence is a cause and effect of this vicious circle, which includes several political, socio-economic problems, very deep problems. So therefore, religion is a small issue in this major socio-political crisis. So the last point I want to emphasize is the issue of ISIS in Syria and Iraq. Okay? So if you follow the first and second point, now it makes sense the third one. Why? Because Salafi jihadism bringing in European and Libyan and North African jihadists, these two countries, and these two countries have been in a major crisis. So in 2003, American invasion of Iraq abolished the army, abolished the Ba'ath Party, which meant the collapse of the state. And then the recent civil war in Syria meant also collapse of the state. And anyone who read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan or any philosophical book about the importance of the state knows that chaos brings violence. If there is no law enforcement, if there is no strong state, people become bold towards each other. You cannot trust your neighbor. Under these circumstances, citizenship is no longer an identity. People try to tie with sectarian and ethnic identities. And if you look at these two states, Syria and Iraq, Sunnis in both are marginalized and persecuted by the state authority. After the US invasion of Iraq, Iraq turned into a pro-Iranian and Shia-dominated country. So Prime Minister Maliki really marginalized Sunnis. We can elaborate on more in Q&A if you want. And then in Syria, before the civil war, Sunnis were marginalized, though they were a majority. In the civil war, many of them were killed. And then ISIS somehow emerged as a strong fighting Sunni force. Therefore, Sunnis who had no choice regarded ISIS lesser than two evils, which was wrong, but that's the case. So therefore, the collapse of state in Syria and Iraq is the primary reason for the rise of ISIS and the Sunni support of this crazy radical terrorist group. What is the lesson for the future? I think if you follow the three items, first of all, yes, Islam is a peaceful religion, but there should be more preaching, more emphasis on moderate understanding of Islam rather than Salafi jihadism. Second, Western countries, or the world in general, should contribute to the political, socio-economic problems of the Middle East to break the vicious circle and to create a virtuous circle. And last but not least, for the Syrian and Iraqi case, especially on the issue of ISIS, so killing ISIS members will not solve the problem in the long run. there should be an equal opportunity for Sunnis in both countries, and there should be a political solution based on citizenship, and the Shia and Alawite oppression over the Sunni populations in both countries should be at least limited in order to solve the problem of ISIS. Thanks for the attention.
Thank you, Ahmed, for that valuable historical insights. Our third speaker comes from a very distinguished Shia family in the Middle East. He has completed his undergraduate work in Islamic sciences and is now doing a master's degree in Islamic studies and leadership at Bayan Claremont Graduate School. And he currently serves as a part-time Islamic educator at communities across North America and the United Kingdom. Please welcome Syed Mahdi Kazwini.
Thank you. I think I should have requested to go first because now it's going to be recycling information. But don't worry, Imam Jihad, there's something special for us. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, distinguished panelists, honored guests, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace, blessings of God be with all of you. First of all, I'd like to thank Pacifica Institute for putting together this wonderful, important event and extending the invitation. The topic is Muslim voices against extremism. There's a few points that I'd like to make in the constrained time that we have. I think, first of all, that as Muslims, we should be unequivocal and consistent in denouncing extremism and terrorism. So whether Muslims are placed in the spotlight or whether they're not placed in the spotlight, whether the perpetrators of extremism are Muslims or whether the victims of extremism are Muslims, we should be unequivocal and we should be consistent. And this is based on the core foundations, the core beliefs and tenets of Islam. As Brother Ahmed Pur mentioned, one of the verses of the Quran states that he who gives life to a soul, it is as if he has given life to all of humanity. And he who takes away life from a soul unjustly, it is as if he has taken the souls of all of humanity. So this is our core, this is our base. And the Quran does not distinguish between a Muslim and a non-Muslim. We should be consistent in speaking out against extremism. Now, since the last Muslim Voices Against Extremism panel took place in Irvine towards the end of January, that event took place, for those of you who know, during the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris. And during those attacks, you had so-called Muslim perpetrators, and you had non-Muslim and Muslim victims as well. One of the police officers who was shot, Ahmed Marabit, was a Muslim defending the French citizens. Since then, many events have unfolded, here in the United States particularly. We've had many tragic events, such as the shootings, the murders which took place in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, of 3 young Muslim students who were bright, amazing, productive, young contributors to society. We had a shooting in Canada. We had a few isolated incidents here and there, and most recently, the murder of a young Iraqi man by the name of Ahmed al-Jumaili, who had just arrived in the United States. It had been maybe about a month that he was married, and he was taking pictures of snow outside of his home in Dallas, Texas, and he was shot and killed. So our situation is constantly evolving. It shows us that you can have Muslim or so-called Muslim perpetrators, and you can have Muslim victims as well. You can have so-called Christian perpetrators, and you can have Christian victims as well. So that means that we have to be, not only as Muslims, but as human beings, unequivocal and consistent in our condemnation of extremism and terrorism. One concern that some Westerners may have is that why are Muslims not speaking out against extremism? Why are they not speaking out against terrorism? Why are they not denouncing the atrocities that ISIS or ISIL or Daesh or whatever they want to call themselves, that they're committing? Why is that not being denounced? Well, I can tell you this, out of my experience in serving in Muslim communities, that some Muslims here in the West also have that same concern when it comes to Muslim lives being taken by so-called Christians or non-Muslims. They have that same concern, is that why don't we hear enough? The answer is that people are speaking out. Muslims are speaking out against these so-called Muslim extremists, and non-Muslims, Christians, are speaking out against people who perpetrate crimes in their name as well. We cannot be selective about what we want to hear. We have to be open listeners. This is one point. The second point is that if we want to reach a conclusion, a solution, we have to tackle the issue at its source. In regards to the Middle East, in the Middle East, there are economic, social, political, and sectarian grievances and concerns. Some of these are legitimate concerns, and some of them are unfortunately masked by what seems to be piety and religiosity. I'll give you an example. One legitimate political and social concern, and these concerns, by the way, they always lead to extreme circumstances. So if you look at Egypt, in 2011, the revolution which took place against the government of Hosni Mubarak, the problem there, the main problem, was that you had unemployment, people could not get married, they could not create families, there was joblessness, there was poverty, and that led to an extreme circumstance which eventually led to the revolution. So these are legitimate concerns which exist. On the other hand, you have other social and political grievances which are legitimate in themselves, but eventually they get tangled up in religious fervor and they become hijacked by what seems to be religiosity. An example of this is what is happening in Iraq today. In Iraq, post-2003, the Sunni population had legitimate political, social, and sectarian concerns. As you know, the Ba'ath Party, a mainly Sunni party, ruled from the mid-60s up until 2003. And after 2003, the Shia-led dominated government came in, and there was marginalization of the Sunni population. They had legitimate concerns. Now, what happened, unfortunately, is that those concerns were hijacked by groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And what they did was they evolved their movement to make it sound like it was a legitimate religious movement, that these people were defending Sunnis against Shia oppression, which is not the case at all. I'll give you an example. Today, ISIS in Iraq have aligned themselves with a group known as the Naqshbandi army. The Naqshbandi army is led by one Izzat Ibrahim al-Duri, a man who belonged to the Ba'ath Party, the right-hand man of Saddam Hussein, and they've created an army which has aligned itself with ISIS. Now, here's the irony. ISIS subscribes to a theology which perceives the theology which the Naqshbandi army subscribes to, namely the Sufi Naqshbandi order. ISIS perceives them in their theology as heretics. These guys are outside of the religion. If they were truly religious, if they truly wanted what they refer to as khilafa ala manhaj al-nubuwah, that a caliphate upon the practice of the Prophet, the original, pure interpretation of Islam, they would be fighting these guys. They would be fighting the Naqshbandi army. But because there are political grievances, So, they get together because they have a bigger enemy. So there are social grievances, there are political grievances, but sometimes they get hijacked. Another point that I want to make is that in the Middle East, and this is a fact, there is sheer ignorance. Sheer ignorance about Islam and the core teachings of Islam. Much of the Islamic education that many people receive happens once a week at the Friday prayer for 20 or 25 minutes, where I heard of an imam in a central mosque in a central city in an Islamic country for half an hour talk about the proper use of a miswak, the natural toothbrush that's made out of wood, how to clean your teeth. That's the education that they get. They're not taught about what the Quran says about peace and violence. They're not taught about what the Hadith says about peace and violence. And thus, when you have sheer ignorance, it becomes easy to quote or actually misquote the Quran and the Hadith and warp people's minds. You may have heard a few months ago or a few weeks ago, there was a couple of Westerners, young Western youth who went to join ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And they were completely ignorant. So what did they do? They went to Amazon and they ordered a couple of copies of Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies. True story. That's because there's sheer ignorance. So that's another issue that needs to be tackled. And this ignorance, I believe, it could be unintentional and it could be intentional. I believe that the governments, and this happens especially with dictatorships in the Middle East, it serves their interests when their population, their people are ignorant people. Okay, I'm going to wrap up in 1 minute. So I believe that in addition to these points, that as Muslims, what is our responsibility as Muslims? Muslims must be progressive, we must be forward thinkers, and that entails that we are critical of our own tradition. Now, any tradition, whether it is based on the Old or New Testaments or based on the Quran or the Hadith corpus, any of that has problematic elements. And sometimes we criticize the problematic elements in another faith without removing the plank from our own eyes. As Muslims, we should engage in self-criticism. And the reason why is because when ISIS committed a certain atrocity last month, they took a Jordanian pilot, Mu'adh al-Kasasba. They had shot down his plane. He had landed in their areas or whatever. They had put him in a cage and they burned him alive. And they videotaped that. Now, I saw a Snapchat just of that video where they had taken a quote, a certain quote from a medieval Islamic scholar, which seems to support this kind of behavior. Now, needless to say, it was totally taken out of context. It was misunderstood. But the average American or Western non-Muslim, or even the average Muslim, won't be able to tell the difference between what is true, genuine Islam or what is not genuine Islam. And one of the solutions to that is that we become self-critical and we filter out problematic parts of the tradition in a very professional and academic manner. I hope I was able to address some of the concerns, and I think I went a few minutes over my time, but thank you.
Thank you, Saeed. Dispelling ignorance does take time, and I'm glad you're taking the time this evening to increase our knowledge. Our last presenter is also an educator. He is president of the Bayan Claremont Islamic Graduate School. He had been involved in research on Islamic law and jurisprudence, along with theology. His current interests include identity formation in the American Muslim community. Please welcome Jihad Turk.
So I just want to say two things at the start. The first, Syed Mehdi Qazwini is one of our students, so I'll make sure to make note to his professor to give him extra credit for that wonderful presentation. And the second, I have to thank the Pacifica Institute for their courage and the guts to invite someone named Jihad to speak against extremism. So I think that's just a really quick note on that for those who didn't get the joke. Jihad is my given name. I was born in the 70s before anyone here knew what jihad meant, and I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and people just thought that it was a very exotic Mexican name. Maybe Oaxacan or something. Jihad. But my father always told me growing up, when people on the soccer team or at school would call me Jay, he said, no, your name is Jihad, and we gave you that name because it has such a great meaning. It means the struggle to do the right thing. And so I always tried to live up to that ideal. My wife can tell you that I don't always do that, but I always took pride in trying to live up to that name. And one time I was giving the sermon at the Islamic Center of Southern California, and one of the enthusiastic congregants came up to me afterwards. He says, Jihad, we were so proud of you. We want to make you represent us in politics and go into Congress or represent us in local city government, but we have to change your name first. So I said, we won't change my name, we'll change the understanding of the name to the true understanding of because jihad is at the core of Islamic teachings, and Muslim community understands jihad in a different way than it's used in the media, and even attempted to be used by the extremists around the world. And it is that struggle to try and be a good person. And that's something that one of my rabbi colleagues told me. He said, you know, feel free to quote me on this. The closest translation for jihad in Hebrew is Israel, the one who struggles with God, right? So, so it is at the core of our faith, and it is part of what it means to be a good Muslim. And part of jihad is the inner struggle, but there's also a jihad in society. And the work of Pacifica Institute to try and bridge the gap of understanding and put on humanitarian programs and educational programs that uplift not just the local Muslim community, but the society in which that surrounds them here in Southern California and throughout the West Coast is really an admirable effort in jihad. So I have limited time, and I was going to retell you the narrative and how it is that we perceive our prophet as an example of a peacemaker and someone who countered extremism in the face of extreme circumstances. But having heard the panel and reflecting a little bit upon recent events, I thought I would share with you instead some of the work that we've been doing in Los Angeles, where I'm based, in the run-up to the White House Summit that took place just a few weeks ago. And I was invited to the White House, and I participated, and we had a roundtable with Vice President Biden, and President Obama came on Wednesday and on Thursday. He gave two major speeches. I don't know if any of you saw the speeches, but I was just a few feet away from him and was very moved by what he had to say, and was very impressed, because one of the things that struck me in the run-up to the participation in this summit on countering violent extremism, I was struck by three things. The first thing is, despite the fact that the administration is getting a little bit of pushback on it, the first thing is the administration, and we had several meetings across multiple sectors of society in Southern California, sectors that on the one hand were involved in media. We had the Southern Poverty Law Center that deals with hate groups. We had ACLU. We had the Anti-Defamation League from the Jewish community participate. We had multiple Muslim community leaders, religious leaders, but also nonprofit leaders who were involved in integration of immigrant communities who were facing trauma back home and who came over as refugees to the United States. We had a really diverse group of people that were involved in the planning process to our presentation that we gave at the White House. 17 of us were selected, 6 from the Muslim community in Los Angeles, and we met up with colleagues from Minneapolis and from Boston in our presentation at the White House. But 3 things struck me in those meetings that we had. When we heard the administration speak and explain why it is that they were undertaking this effort to look at the best practices of engagement to counter violent extremism, not just within the Muslim community, but broadly speaking, is number one, it was broadly speaking. Yes, there were maybe more Muslims there than other communities, because in some ways the administration sees that as a growing problem, especially with the proliferation of targeted efforts on ISIS online and recruiting Westerners in general and Americans in particular. So, but it was a broad-based approach to countering all forms of violent extremism, and I thought that was great. The second thing is the administration, and I think rightly so, acknowledged that, and this is based on evidence from the intelligence community, in which they gave presentations there, both Homeland Security and CIA and FBI, or not CIA, the FBI and other law enforcement agencies. They gave presentations to us about what the problem is, and we asked them, what's the profile of the person that's being targeted and recruited? And they said there is no common profile. There's nothing in common amongst these people. They come from different ethnicities, different ages, different backgrounds, male and female. It's very, there's no common profile except one thing. They said they all bought into the narrative that America was at war with Islam. They all felt that, and then they identified somehow those who were fighting specifically for ISIS, or went to travel to fight with ISIS, they all bought into that narrative. And the administration's focus on countering not just violent extremist narratives, which really the administration can't do because that goes into the, crosses the line of the separation between church and state, and it's not really the role of government to tell us what true Islam is. That's our role as a Muslim community. But the administration's role, in part, is to counter the narrative that America is at war with Islam. And so President Obama's insistence, under a lot of pressure, and I saw him on the Sunday morning programs, and I saw a lot of the tough questions he was getting, and he kept his ground firm. I applaud him for that because he's basing that strategy on sound advice from the intelligence community. And the intelligence community is oftentimes very conservative. It's not a liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican issue. I mean, some of the delegations that we went with and from LA were rather conservative law enforcement members. And when the president made those comments, I turned to my colleague from the LAPD, the deputy chief, and I said, what do you think? What do you think about that stance that he's taken to specifically emphasize that America is not at war with Islam? He said, that is the right approach. That is the right message, because based on our intelligence, that will undermine some of the efforts that are made by these recruiters to attract young minds. So that was the second thing, is that he's taking an approach, despite some political heat, to stand his ground. The third thing that struck me was that the administration was looking not just at countering rhetoric, either through violent extreme, the helping Muslims or those who are empowered to develop a narrative and get their narrative out, and putting together the Muslim community with Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and all of that, which they did a great job, and Hollywood people, which they did a great job of helping us connect with the private sector to develop our message. But also, the administration recognizes, and part of the president's speech was to highlight that the fact that, as Dr. Kuro indicated, there are root causes. There are circumstances that can lead not just to regions developing violent tendencies, but for individuals to be susceptible to joining such gangs, really, violent gangs, or criminal gangs, or terrorist gangs. And one of the things that we've done in the Muslim community in Los Angeles is we've looked at this problem thoroughly by collaborating with other communities that have at-risk youth who are being recruited to gangs, local gangs. And we have a few of those in LA. You might have heard about them in the news. And so we went to Father Greg Boyle, who runs something called Homeboy Industries, and tries to get people out of the gangs. And we said, tell us, from your deep experience for these decades of working with gang members here in Southern California, how, you know, what is the profile of the person that you're dealing with? And I was impressed to learn that what he shared with us and what the Homeland Security and Intelligence Community shared with us matched. They said that there are three things that lead someone to being at risk. They said the first thing is cognitive, that they have a cognitive opening. Now that's mumbo jumbo talk for meaning someone that either has mental illness, they have a maladjusted home situation, and that could be, you know, a large number of American, you know, American population, divorced parents or dysfunctionality in the family, etc. They could be ill-adjusted because of identity issues, because of race and ethnicity, because of immigration. So any one of those things could put someone in an at-risk category because they have a cognitive opening. They're not quite settled. Just in youthfulness in general, the teenage angst sometimes can be enough. And so number two is that they have a grievance. And as Saeed Mehdi pointed out, sometimes those grievances are legitimate, sometimes they're not, but they have a grievance, whatever that issue is. And one of the grievances that I referenced earlier is that America is at war with Islam, and if part of their identity is tied in with that faith, then that can sometimes lead them to number three, which is someone recruits them, someone reaches out to them, someone touches them, someone grabs them and says, you are important, you have value, you have a greater purpose, and it's to come and join us, and we have a support network. Same thing works with gangs. People have the same three things, and then someone reaches out and says, join our gang, we'll become your family, we'll support you. What are gangs involved in? Violence and criminality and drugs and all these things, which, you know, for the average person seems very scary, but if you are, you know, brought into the inner circle and said, you know, well, you'll have this power, you'll have this adventure, you'll have this support, then it could be appealing to a young mind. And so those same things apply to this effort in countering violent extremism, and being empowered with that knowledge is something very helpful. One of the things that they showed us are, they showed us videos on what kind of social media efforts they're making. Now, just to give you a sense of the sheer volume, one of the statistics that they shared with us, and we had the head of Twitter there, one of the lead people in Twitter, they said that they have several tens of thousands of Twitter accounts, that they're constantly being shut down and regenerating new fake accounts to support ISIS. They tweet, on average, 90,000 tweets a day in support of ISIS. 90,000 tweets a day. There isn't anywhere near that volume in countering that narrative. 90,000, that's just on Twitter, let alone all the other social media platforms. So, you know, it's a huge task. Now, they also showed us video clips that they put up on YouTube and other things. Now, we were asked, have you, you know, at one of these workshops and lead up to the summit, they said, have you seen their recruiting efforts, their magazines, and their, and, you know, with a name like Jihad, I have to say, I don't go to those websites. I'm just saying as a U.S. attorney here. So, honestly, I had no idea what those videos looked like, but I was very curious, and they said, okay, it's probably a good idea that you don't do that. Just saying. But they showed us one, and then they, you know, they parsed it, and they were very simple kind of recruiting videos. There was one, I remember, it was so simple, it was maybe 30 seconds, and it just showed an ISIS fighter, a young guy, kind of tall and handsome, with, you know, he had a little bit of a, you know, a little bit of a beardo. You know, it's now in fashion in the United States to have a little bit of a what's that generation of young people? Hipsters, yeah. He was a little hipster-esque, walking around in a makeshift hospital visiting wounded ISIS fighters, and there was a sense of fraternity and a calm and tranquility to it. And it's just a 30-second video clip, and he's speaking, it's not even Arabic, I don't even know what language he was speaking, and you don't really need to know. You get the sense of like, wow, okay, I want to be part of that fraternity and support, and look at how confident, and that was it. That was the recruiting video. Oh, really? 30 more minutes. Excellent. The other video that they showed us was, and I kid you not, they showed ISIS, again, fighters, they had the guns and all of that. They were in this outdoor market, and they were throwing candy out to kids. They were giving candy to children. And then they got the children to shout some kind of slogan in support of ISIS. I mean, it's just very simple. They're not really, and they always talk about the sophisticated marketing. It's not that they have, this really high, although they're according to marketers, the conceptualization of how they're targeting their audience is very sophisticated. The video clips are very simple, but that's on purpose, because that's who there's a sense of authenticity to it, and that's what resonates with young people. So I'll just say in conclusion that despite all of that bad news, the good news is I have come to have some degree of confidence, although in the administration and in law enforcement, both local and national, in some of the efforts that they're taking in partnering with the Muslim community as allies in protecting our country. And they recognize that the Muslim community is best positioned to secure our nation. And as Imam Taha indicated, mosques are not the recruiting grounds for these individuals. It's the people who are not exposed to the mainstream understanding of the tradition and who are ignorant, as Sayyid Mehdi said, and we had that information shared with us as well. They're completely ignorant of the religion to the point where they're getting books on Islam for Dummies on their way to the battlefield because it's not really inspired by the religion. And to put it differently, religion is not really the source of the extremism, but it could be part of the solution in countering that extremism. I thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to talking to you.
Thank you very much, Scott, and for the wisdom and practical, including, I think, perhaps one of the best